The king is dead. Long live the king. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus lay bleeding out in the palace of the kings, his own courtroom having become his place of death. The first leader of the Romans to die by a conspiracy from someone among his own people. Tarquin had been a beloved king. He had expanded Roman influence further than ever before. He had built grand structures such as the Circus Maximus. He had been generous and given riches to his people. He had been so popular that he managed to hoard more power than ever before in the office of the king. But now the king was dead, and a new one was needed. A king that would be just as popular amongst the people. A king that could lead Rome into the future. And such a king was just there, amongst the people watching Tarquin die. The assassins of Tarquin did not get far and was caught by the lictors before they had exited the courtroom. A crowd of people started gathering outside, drawn by the noise of the situation that had just occurred. Tanaquil, the queen of Rome, ordered the palace gates shut and brought remedies for the king's wound, even though she knew there was no hope for his survival. Next, Tanaquil called for Servius Tullius and sent everyone else away from the room. Tanaquil seized Servius' hand and begged him to avenge the murder of Rome's loved monarch, to bring justice to the city and its people. Next she uttered these words: "The throne is yours, if you are a man. It shall never be theirs who have done this deed of blood. Rise to your true stature. Follow the gods who long ago by the circlet of heavenly fire declared that your head should wear the crown. Let the memory of those flames, assuredly divine, rouse you to act. Now is the time, now you must awake indeed. The king and I were foreigners, yet the throne was ours. Forget your origins, and remember only what you are, your manhood. Do as I bid, and all will be well." After having uttered these words, Tanaquil next went out onto a balcony to address the growing crowd outside. The balcony was near the temple of Jupiter Stator, a temple to the king of the gods himself. It was like the chief god was present to listen and guide Tanaquil's words. The queen urged the people to be calm. She declared that Tarquin, their king, had merely suffered a surface wound and been stunned by the blow. He had in fact already regained his consciousness. His wounds had been cleaned and he was currently still cared for. The people would soon get to see their beloved king again, and in the meanwhile, Servius Tullius, who was also loved by the city and its people, would govern in the king's confidence, and more than so, he would see justice done to the traitors who had attempted regicide. The people were exalted at the notion that their king was still alive, and that during his recovery the beloved Servius would rule as his deputy. The crowd scattered and a calm returned to the city. Servius Tullius would in the following day begin wearing the ensigns of royalty that Tarquin had won for Rome in his wars against the Etruscans. He would wear the purple robe of royalty and be preceded by the 12 victors holding the fasces. He would sit on the king's throne as his deputy, listening to suits, settling some himself and pretending to refer others to Tarquin, who the people still believed to be alive. Slowly and surely, Servius strengthened his position and made the people used to seeing him as their sovereign. As for Ancus's sons, who had assassinated the monarch in the first place to gain the kinship for themselves, they had now fled into exile as Susenia Pometia, a Latin city, after hearing of their lackey's capture and the report that they had failed in their mission. Servius had actually called for their trial, but knowing that showing up would be their death, they instead escaped, never to return to their mother city again. Ancus Marcius's sons were not the only threat to Servius' newly gained power though. The late King Tarquin had sired 2 sons himself, Lucius and Aruns. These 2 boys might in actuality have been his grandsons, because if one considers them Tarquin's sons, the age and timeline does not add up over the following parts of the chronology. If so is the case, then Tarquin's actual son is lost to time, but it matters little for the narrative. Sons or grandsons, Servius was afraid that these boys would grow up and resent his authority, just as the sons of Ancus had resented Tarquin. For this reason, Servius decided to marry Lucius and Aruns to his own daughters, connecting their two families by blood. He hoped this would calm down any plans of conspiracy against him, but rumors were abound that more people, especially patricians of the city, had gotten jealous of Servius's power grab. Because of this jealousy, the government quickly turned into a hotbed of intrigue and treachery. The glass of intrigue that started filling up against Servius was about to spill over. Servius knew he could not keep the death of the king quiet for long, so after he had established his power base, he announced, to the surprise of the people, that a funeral was going to be held for the now deceased king Tarquinius Priscus. The king had succumbed to his wounds, Servius explained, and he would now rule in his children's name as the guardian of the royal children. Next, Servius held a magnificent funeral for Tarquin and built a grand monument honoring his time on the throne. The people loved Servius, so they cared little that he had basically co-opted the government at this point, but the opinion of the patricians was wholeheartedly different. They despised the idea that Servius held on to power without any of the legitimizing grants having been bestowed upon him. Servius had not been approved by the Senate or the people, and at the moment he did not hold any title that would give him sovereignty of the city. The patricians planned to force him from power the next time Servius assembled the Senate, but it was not to be. Servius, now having an iron hold over the government, quickly became aware of the Senate's scheming, so he assembled the people of Rome, brought out the royal children, and held a speech in which he argued that as the guardian of these children, he had to stay in his position so nothing bad would happen to them. He also told the people that because their previous beloved king had given them the subjugation of not only the Latins, but the Sabines and Etruscans too, it was now up to the people to repay that generosity by giving their support to Tarquin's sons, and in turn to Servius, until they were old enough to hold the title of king themselves. The fact that Rome was not a hereditary monarchy seems to have been thrown out of the window at this point. As mentioned in my previous video on Tarquinius Priscus, he had been a populist king that had garnered the love of the people at the expense of the aristocracy. Servius now wanted to use that power base Tarquin had built up to hold power himself. The patricians could yell and complain all they wanted. If all of Rome was against them, with Servius on top holding the scepter, there was not much they could do. Next, Servius announced that anyone that was indebted and could not repay their debts by their own means, that Servius would from his own pockets free them from their debts. He would also create a new law that made it so no one could be put in prison for being unable to repay loaned money, as was currently the custom of the city. Next, he also announced that he would make a change in how war taxes were collected. Instead of collecting a set sum from each citizen, as was currently the case, in the future that sum of tax paid would be based on a valuation of what each citizen owned. This would make it so no one would have to pay more than he could afford. Servius also stated that as their leader he would always be just and would not let the rich trample over the poor, but instead always keep all citizens of Rome in his mind when governing. The people praised Servius after his speech and gave him their full loyalty and support. Having held on to power thus far thanks to the people of Rome, Servius now had to show that he could enact all the things he had promised to his subjects. He would begin with paying off the people's debts, and after this, to make the people love him more, he enacted an edict which stated that it was now illegal to hold public land without the approval of the king. A lot of public land taken in war from Rome's enemies and paid for by the people's blood had been amassed illegally by the patricians of the city. This was now to be seized by the state and given out to citizens who owned no land of their own. Not only would this make Servius incredibly popular among the lower classes, it was also probably a prelude to his later reorganization of the constitution, which would be heavily based on land ownership, and would therefore work better if more people owned land. The Senate and patricians of the city, noticing how popular and loved Servius Tullius had become amongst the people, now changed their plans. Whereas before they had wanted to force Servius out of power and have a following interregnum, which was constitutionally what always happened after the death of a king, they now understood that in such a following interregnum, Servius would be elected to the kingship either way. It was better for him to exist in this limbo of sovereignty, not holding any title or real legitimacy, than to entrench his power base by holding a vote and him winning it. In the current state of affairs, the Senate could always in the future, when they held a stronger position, coup Servius out of his position, and they would have the law and constitution backing them up to do it. Servius, being both smart and politically savvy, would quickly understand what the Senate was up to and would work to leave them no room for a future power grab against him. He again went to the forum, this time with the entire royal family. The royal children, Tanaquil, the late king's wife, and Servius' current wife, Tarquin's daughter. Once there, he held another speech exclaiming that he had been handed information that the Senate was plotting against his life. He told the gathered masses that after his death the patricians wanted to undo all of his edicts. The moneylenders would once again throw debtors in prison. The land distributed to the poor would be seized by the wealthy once more, and taxes would again be increased on the citizens. Not only this, but the Senate was also ready to hand the kingship to Ancus's sons that had so recently committed a heinous act of regicide. After his speech, Servius made it look like he was going to leave the podium, but as he did so, a massive clamor of rage and fear emitted from the people of Rome. They raged against the patricians and the Senate, fearing what they would do if they took power. Next, some men that Servius had placed amongst the masses started yelling, "Make him king!" And soon after, the entire crowd was chanting the very same. Servius, knowing that his propaganda had worked, told his people how grateful he felt for their loyalty, and then decided upon a date for the vote. When the date arrived, Servius won the vote for the throne easily. The new monarch did not even ask the Senate for ratification of the results, as was customary, but instead told them to go hang. Servius Tullius was now officially the 6th king of Rome. Servius would, after his political victory over the Senate, begin with his magnum opus. He would overhaul the entire Roman constitution. Firstly, the king would create and conduct the first ever Roman census, a count and partition of the Roman population with citizenship into classes and centuries. This new partition and its containing groups would be called the Comitia Centuriata, or the Centuriate Assembly. The census was such a useful political invention that it would live on through all of Roman history and the rest of human history in different forms of population counts. The reason for creating the census and the Centuriate Assembly was to make it easier to conscript the masses of people now living inside of Rome's territory. It would also make it easier to distinguish people from their class in society, because the partition of the people was now based on property, meaning richer men owning more land would be put into a higher class, while the poorer men in the lower ones. The scale of the following partition was as follows. Men whose family estate had a capital value of 100,000 asses or more would be put in the first class. 1 ass was a unit of bronze weighing 1 pound or around half a kilo. This first class would have its men divided into 80 centuries, 40 of seniors and 40 of juniors. The seniors would be used for civil defense, while the juniors for field service. These men, who were the richest in Rome, were required to equip themselves from their own wealth with a helmet, maybe in the Italic negao style, a clypeus, which was a bowl-shaped shield, greaves, and a breastplate, of which all was to be made from bronze. They were also required to acquire a sword and a spear as offensive weapons. This equipment was essentially the same as the Greek hoplite warriors. The first class would also have 2 extra centuries attached to it, which were engineer centuries. The men in these 2 centuries were unarmed, but instead had the duty of constructing and maintaining the legion's siege engines. The second class would be comprised of men who were valued between 100,000 and 75,000 asses. This class would contain 20 centuries, 10 seniors and 10 juniors. They were required to equip themselves with everything the first class had, except the breastplate, and had an oblong scutum shield instead of a round clypeus one. The third class consisted of men with a property rating between 75,000 and 50,000 asses, had the same number of centuries as the second class, senior and juniors included, and needed everything as the previous class except the bronze greaves. The fourth class also had 20 centuries, both seniors and junior, but was filled with men of a property rating between 50,000 and 25,000. These men only had to carry a spear and a javelin, no armor. The fifth and last class were filled with men of a property rating between 25,000 and 11,000 asses. This class would have 30 centuries, 15 each of senior and juniors. They would only have to carry with them slings and stones. Rated with them were 2 extra centuries of trumpeters. The men who were under 11,000 asses in property value were all formed into a single century that was exempt from military service. This new big reorganization of the Roman constitution changed more than just the soldiers' equipment though. It also brought newer and better tactics on how the legion would fight. Servius organized his army with the earlier mentioned equipment because it fitted well with fighting in the Greek phalanx style of warfare. The Greek city-states had long used phalanx warfare in their clashes with each other and against foreign enemies, and this tactic had started to spread amongst the different peoples of Italy. The Etruscans had been especially sufficient in adopting the phalanx as their preferred fighting style. The Romans, having been in contact with the Etruscans through trade, cultural exchange, and especially recently in warfare, would now also start fighting in this style. In a phalanx, soldiers would be drawn up in ranks. The ranks in the back would continuously push the front ranks into the enemies, so no soldiers in the front could cower and start retreating. When the front ranks were battered enough so they could not fight more, the second rank would take their place. This would continue until no more ranks existed. The importance of the spear overtook the sword in this style of warfare. Fighting in these tight shoulder-to-shoulder phalanx formations gave little room for sword swinging, but instead relied heavily on spear thrusting while protecting yourself behind your shield. The first class did still carry swords though, as mentioned earlier, but these were probably in the Antennae type or the Greek Kopis type. Both of these swords were made for slashing, the Kopis one particularly overhand slashing, which could still be done in a tightly packed phalanx formation. When the new classes were assembled in battle formation, the first class would make up the 2 first ranks of the infantry. These men had the most protective and the best offensive equipment, so having them fight in the front would use their abilities and equipment to the max. If needed, the second class, who were formed in the third and fourth ranks behind the first class, would move up and engage the enemy. If the second class failed, the third class, with their respective 5th and 6th ranks, would move up and engage the enemy until at last, in extreme circumstances, the 4th class, which was the last men in the 7th and 8th ranks, would move up and fight too. The 5th class was stationed outside the line of battle, as they only had ranged ways of engaging the enemy. They would support the melee infantry. Every century would choose the bravest amongst them to be their commander, or centurion. It was the centurion's responsibility to keep his century obedient and ready at all times. When the entire legion was formed like this, it would most likely consist of approximately 6,000 men, but all of these men would naturally be split amongst many phalanxes. There needs to be stated that this whole organization of 5 classes is criticized on its historical accuracy by many modern historians. These historians argue that this system is far too in-depth and complicated for the early Roman monarchy in the 500 BC. An alternative theory that has been presented is instead that Servius, or someone like him, organized the new legions into 2 classes, called the classis and infraclassis. The classes would have 40 centuries, with 100 men each, making the entire sum of the classes 4,000 men. The men in the classes would be equipped with hoplite armor, in other words, the equipment of the first class in the 5-class system. The classes of the 4,000 men would fight in phalanx formation. The citizens who could not afford hoplite equipment would be put in the infraklassen and would function as light support troops. Later down the line, around 400 BC, in the Republican era, the centuries would increase to 60, making the phalanx legion consist of 6,000 men. These new 20 centuries would consist of 10 from the 2nd class and 10 from the 3rd class in the earlier 5-class account. Usually, if a phalanx formation engaged with tribes that had not yet appropriated the tactic, the phalanx would win easily. Their tight-knit formation, protected by their shields and using their spears to thrust away at the enemy, who could not reach or find a weak point to attack, led to easy victories. The enemy tribe of unorganized warriors would slowly but surely lose too many men and panic, not knowing what to do, leading to a general rout. If the phalanx was fighting another phalanx, the two sides would usually meet each other head on, thrusting their spears against each other while the back ranks pushed their colleagues into the enemy to never give them a second of respite. When two phalanx met like this, a lot of the men in the front ranks would die, being trapped between their allies behind, pushing them into their enemy's spears in the front. Moreover than the 5 classes, Servius also reorganized the cavalry, or as it was known as then, the knights, or equites in Latin. The cavalry would consist of 18 centuries that would together make up 1,800 men and be filled with the most prominent men in Rome, most likely patricians. Romulus had created 3 centuries of cavalry back when he was king, and the last monarch, Tarquinius Priscus, had wanted to add 3 more, but instead had to settle with increasing the size of the original 3 because of arguments over religious omens. It was probably felt though that an increase and reorganization of the cavalry was needed. It had been incredibly important in Rome's recent clashes and wars. The difference from these centuries and the other 5 classes was that each of the cavalry century was granted 10,000 asses from the kingdom's treasury for the purchase of horses and a further grant of 2,000 asses a year for their upkeep. This money would be leveled on rich widows in Rome. Buying one's own horse and maintaining it was probably seen as too big of a burden to ask for in the defense of their homeland, even for the patricians of Rome. This expanded cavalry is also debated and argued against by modern historians. Today it is believed that archaic Rome would in no way be able to muster 1,800 cavalry soldiers. That amount of horses would have been far too expensive for the kingdom. The cavalry that is described is instead believed to be a much later creation during the Republic. The centuries already existing under Romulus and increased under Tarquin, it is argued, was never really a true cavalry force. The name of equites could instead have been an honorific title, and could in reality have been an elite guard, that under Servius' reform instead became an elite rank of hoplites. Going back to the ancient sources and examining the 5-class system Servius created, One can quickly notice by looking at the number of centuries and how they were distributed that the classes of richer citizens had far more centuries than the poorer classes. This naturally led to the centuries in class 1, for example, containing less men than the one in the other classes. The century of poorer citizens valued under 11,000 asses must have contained a far numerical superiority than the one in the first class. In any society, the number of rich men were far fewer than the poor ones. Under this new system, mobilization would be based on how many centuries were needed, but every time some centuries from all classes would be called upon. Because there were more centuries in the first class but fewer people in those centuries, the richer people of the population would be mobilized more often. Taxation would also be based on which class you were in. The richer the class, the more you would pay in tax. This extra taxation was especially noticeable during the war tax when the centuries were mobilized. Because soldiers were not paid a salary during this early legionary period, a tax was instead levied in which the first classes would pay more. This taxation money would partly go to food for the entire legion. This was needed as soldiers from the 5th class might not have enough capital to buy food for themselves during an entire campaign season. There was another change that came to the Roman constitution with this new Servian system. Maybe the biggest one of them all. The time where every man's vote had counted equally was over. Your vote in this new Servian reform would be valued according to your wealth. The more you owned, the more your vote was valued. Currently, the people in Rome only voted when a new king was to be elected, but even so, that was one important occasion to cast a vote on. There was a reason behind this new way of valuing votes. It was believed and argued that richer men could be easier coerced and would have more inclination to defend the society they lived in. Earlier in the city's history, the legionaries would have to have equipped themselves, and this was still the case. The difference now was that there was a set requirement to how one had to equip oneself. If the legionaries had more standardized equipment, the entire cohesion of the army would function better. The problem was that not everyone could afford to equip themselves with the best equipment, and this is where the class system came in. The richest men in Rome under this new system had to equip themselves with the most gear and would be mobilized more often and taxed higher. These men would use their own wealth to buy and maintain military equipment far more expensive than the lower classes of men. For this reason, they would in return be given the perk of more influence in their political votes. The new voting system would function as follows. Only a set amount of votes was needed to accept or reject a proposition. This set number was the vote of 97 centuries. The people voted in their respective centuries, and the vote turnout in that specific century would decide how the century itself cast its vote. Each century had one vote each. This meant that, for example, Class 1 had 80 votes, while Class 2 only had 20, because that's how many centuries they contained. The richer classes would vote first and then continuously go down in turn. First the equites voted, next the first class, next the second, and so forth until finally the classless voted last. Usually, only the equites and the first class had to vote, because if all of them agreed, they would reach 97 votes, passing the threshold. The patricians and other rich men in the city usually had agreeable opinions with each other, so would vote similarly. Not only that, but each century voted in turn, and the voting took place on the Campus Martius in battle formation. This naturally meant that men who had fought in battle together, creating a strong brotherly bond, and also now voted together, would vote similar to each other. Most often, this voting system led to the other classes, especially the lowest ones, never even getting the chance to vote, because when it was their turn, enough votes had already been cast from the richer classes to meet the said threshold. But in the rare cases where the first class could not agree, the vote would continue to the second class, then the third, and so forth. Because in theory the lower classes still had the right to vote, the illusion of political influence still existed, but in reality Rome had now been turned into a true oligarchy, where the rich held all power while pretending to share it with the rest of the people. Servius proclaimed a law that any citizen who failed to register in his census would be punished with imprisonment or even death. Every Roman was to be registered so he could be mustered in times of crisis or war when needed. When the census had been carried out, all citizens were also ordered to gather in their respective centuries at the Campus Martius for a closing ceremony. At this religious ceremony, termed the lustral close, a pig, sheep, and ox would be sacrificed to Mars, the god of war, to ask him of his approval with the census. At this first ever census, it is said that 80,000 men were registered. Keep in mind that these were only the citizens of Rome capable of bearing arms. No women, slaves, immigrants, or other persons without citizenship were counted in this number. So the city and its surrounding area contained far more people than 80,000, if we can believe the ancient sources. A new census would be done at a 5-year interval to always register new citizens into their respective tribe, class, and centuries. Why did Servius create this new system, which gave so much power to the patricians of the city? The king had risen to power because of the broader masses, so one would believe that he would have been more generous to them in his reorganization. What one has to think about, though, is that the broader masses in Rome most likely did not care much for political influence. This new system made it so they were being taxed less and mobilized less often, which already was a major boon for them. But when the king put this burden of tax and manpower on the patricians, he probably understood that they would never acquiesce if he did not give them something in return. This something would be the control of how the Roman society was run. Servius Tullius had created a constitution which made both sides of society content, more power to the rich and less burdens on the poor. When Servius made these changes to the Roman constitution, he would also change the way the city was divided into tribes. Romulus had divided Rome into 3 tribes, the Ramnes, Titius, and Luceres. Rome had now grown so much that Servius felt that 3 tribes were no longer enough, so he would instead divide the city into 4 tribes. These 4 urban tribes were named the Palatina, Culina, Esquilina, and Suburana. What tribe a citizen was placed in depended on his place of residence. It had nothing to do with wealth as the earlier centuriate assembly. The tribes were probably organized in this way to make it easier when the census population count was being carried out. Instead of having to register everyone at random, they could work through the tribes, registering its people into classes and centuries. Each of the 4 tribes had its own commander assigned to it. It was the job of the commander to know where each citizen enrolled in his tribe lived. The tribes themselves had no correlation to the amount of centuries each class had or in what class a person was placed in. After dividing his city into 4 tribes, Servius went even further and divided all of the countryside that Rome now owned into 17 parts, making the whole number of tribes 21. These 17 rural tribes were named Amelia, Camilia, Claudia, Clustumina, Cornelia, Fabia, Galeria, Horatia, Lemonia, Menenia, Papiria, Pollia, Pupinia, Romilia, Sergia, Voltinia, and Voturia. It is debatable if Servius was actually the creator of all these tribes. Modern historians tend to be in the understanding that Servius created the 4 urban tribes and only divided the countryside into regions. The 2 rural tribes of the Claudia and Clustumina are especially problematic. Claudia, which is named after the Claudii patrician clan, had not yet moved to Rome during Servius' time, so the naming makes little sense. The Clustumina is the only tribe not named after a patrician family, but of a geographical region, which Rome had yet to conquer during Servius Tullius' time, which also makes this name improbable. If Servius created 17 rural tribes or just regions, and the tribes would be a later development, an administrative division was clearly made. No administrative division had been given to Rome's growing countryside until now. It was probably highly needed in order to be able to collect taxes, muster armies, and to exert the city's influence efficiently. Just as the urban tribes, these new rural tribes would make up the people living in their respective regions. Servius also decided to build hill forts, or pagi as they were known to the Romans, on strongly situated hills in the different tribes. These would function as places of refuge for Roman citizens in case of an enemy army's intrusion into Roman territory. In each fort, the rural tribe's governor would have its office, and he was instructed, just as his urban colleagues, to know all the husbandmen who belonged to his tribe and where they held their land. In connection with the pagi, Servius also ordered that every year the respective tribal governor was to conduct a public ritual with his husbandmen. These rituals would be conducted at altars to Ceres, a goddess of vegetation, and Tellus, a goddess of fertility. The altars would be constructed in connection to the pagi, and the sacrificial gifts were home-baked goods. The religious purpose was to ask the gods for good harvests and fertile soil, but because every citizen of each tribe also had to contribute a set sum for the expense of the ritual festival, the whole ordeal also made it an easy way to record how many citizens lived in each rural tribe. The festival was given the name Paganalia, and would be continuously celebrated for centuries to come. During Rome's wars and conquest over neighboring peoples and cities, an increased amount of slaves had been brought to the city. Servius would bring about a change with the concept of slavery in Rome that would still be practiced throughout the entire empire's lifetime. The king made it so slaves could be freed from their enslavement, and after this would become what was to be called freedmen. A freedman would have a limited form of citizenship, where they could vote but could not hold public office. Their children would in turn be full-fledged citizens. When a slave became a freedman, he would take the family name from his previous owner and would become his client. In this way, he was still bound in a sort of pseudo-paternal relation to his previous owner. A client would help his patron in different ways, often political, like voting for him in elections. You did not have to be a freedman to be someone's client. Client-patron relationships were a standard for a lot of Roman citizens. At first, this change was looked upon with disgust from the patricians and the Senate, but Servius argued that nothing in his law forced them to free any slaves they own, it just made it possible for it. He argued that if a slave owner had a good conscience, then after a worthy slave had been his for many years, he would deserve to become free. After a slave became free, he would also, with good conscience, love his former master for granting him a chance at Roman citizenry. This dynamic would also make slaves more loyal to their master, because they would always have a hope of freedom in the future. If a slave was not loyal, or in general was a bad slave, then the owner could just keep him in servitude forever, or kill him if he wanted to, as they were seen as property. After introducing his change of freedmen to his city, Servius would continue to rule as a benevolent king. His next reform would be to his own title. Up to this point, the kings of Rome had ruled in all suits, both private and public. Servius now felt it necessary to create judges to rule in the private cases, as he did not see it necessary to be in the know of all the private suits being created. Public cases concerning the broader Roman Commonwealth, the king would still rule in its outcome, as he was the highest authority in the state. With this ruling, it looked like Servius was nobly giving away parts of his power to these newly created judges, but at the same time he did lessen the workload for himself. With the growth of the city, the amount of cases had probably increased with big margins, so not having to look through all of them himself was probably a big boon for the monarch. The Etruscan cities, who had been subjugated by Tarquinius Priscus, had been starting to action by the city of Veii. This war actually started at the beginning of Servius' reign, before he had attained the title of king, but it would come to rage for a wholly 20 years. During such a long war, there would naturally be downtime where less fighting and campaign took place, which is why Servius was able to conduct the war and at the same time make his changes to the Roman constitution and city. The war itself might have been one reason for the massive reorganization Servius undertook, as a change to the mobilization of the legion might have been needed to achieve victory. Just as the patricians of Rome, the Etruscans despised the notion of being vassals to a slave, as they believed Servius' background was. Servius would begin with sending diplomats to the city of Veii, the leaders of the insurrection against Roman rule, to see if he could end the revolt with diplomatic means. Veii would quickly send back these diplomats into Roman territory, arguing that they and the Etruscans had no treaty binding them to be servants of Rome. During the course of this long war, many incursions by each side into their respective territories would take place. Many pitched battles would also be fought, and in every campaign the Romans conducted, Servius would lead his armies personally. All we know about these battles and campaigns is that Servius would be victorious wherever he took his army. So victorious, in fact, that the Senate honored him with triumphs on 3 different occasions. Only the previous king, Tarquinius, had been honored in such a grand way before. In the 20th year of warfare, the Etruscans must have used up all their efforts to continue fighting, and therefore had to surrender to the king of Rome once again. The 12 cities in revolt sent envoys to Servius, and once again became suppliants to him. Servius would be lenient in his punishments, and allowed all cities except Veii, Caere, and Tarquini to go back to the terms they had agreed upon with Tarquin after his conquests. The 3 cities of Veii, Caere, and Tarquini, who had been the first to revolt, would have parts of their land seized by the Romans, and only after this would they once again become forced allies to Rome. The land seized by Servius would be given out to citizens of his growing population. As stated earlier, Rome had now grown to become a major city in Latium, arguably a significant one in all of Italy, and this is why Servius next decided to extend the city's boundaries. He decided to take in 2 more of the hills in the city's surrounding, the Quirinal and the Viminal. Servius also added to the area on the Esquiline being used. The Esquiline also became the hill in which Servius himself decided to live on. He told the citizens who had no houses of their own to construct them on these new hills inside the city's circuit. With this expanse of the city's circumference, Servius also strengthened its defense by constructing a wall that would be known as the Servian Wall. This was the first wall that would fully enclose the city inside of its circumference. Earlier defensive structures had been built on weak points or at exposed areas, but this new wall would defend Rome from all its sides. Before construction of the wall began, a religious ceremony had to be conducted. In this ceremony, a priest traced the wall's future placement and added a narrow strip of area on both sides of where the wall would be built, where no construction or farming could take place. This area on both sides of the walls was called the city's pomerium, and for every expanse of the city, the pomerium would be pushed further outwards in another similar ritual. Furthermore, Servius also ordered that in every neighborhood of the city, statues of Roman or mythological heroes should be raised by the people living in those neighborhoods. Every year, a sacrifice was also to be held by the people living in each respective neighborhood to these statues. The objects being given to these statues as sacrifices were honey cakes, which made it easy for every family to conduct the ritual. The yearly ritual was always celebrated during a day in the winter months and came to be known as the Compitalia, from the word compiti, meaning street. It was still being celebrated during the time of Emperor Augustus, 500 years later. Servius would also work on improving his religious standing, and by diplomatic means increase the opinion of Rome amongst the Latin cities. He would do both of this with one project. Diplomats were sent out to Latin communities where they worked to the betterment of public relations and praised the harmony and unity among Rome and the cities it had subjugated in Tarquin's wars. Next, Servius pronounced that he would begin the construction of a temple dedicated to Diana, the goddess of the hunt, nature, fertility, and the moon, and that he wanted it built in association with his Latin allies. Many of the Latins now saw Rome as being a kind of capital city in Latium, which is probably why they agreed to spend resources and manpower on a project of this scale. The temple would be grand, and placing it on the Aventine Hill in Rome would lead to Latins streaming into the city to worship there instead of their home cities, strengthening the broader Latin community's ties to Rome. This temple also became a place to settle disputes. The Latin cities could send diplomats to the temple, where sacrifices would be held, symbolizing their dispute's termination. Next, a newly established general council at the temple, consisting of diplomats from the Latin cities, would vote on the outcome of the said dispute. This new way of settling disagreements made every city in Latium have influence over what happened in the region. Inside of the temple to Diana, a bronze pillar would be erected by Servius, inscribed with the agreement between him and his Latin allies in the establishment of the General Council. One day after the temple had been completed, a Sabine man came to Rome with a giant and magnificent heifer. This heifer was in fact so magnificent that its reputation had spread all over Latium, and a legend had started about it that whoever sacrificed this heifer in the service of Diana would give his people imperium. When the Roman priest at the temple of Diana saw the Sabine with this animal, he told him that surely he was not thinking of sacrificing it before performing the act of purification. He told the Sabine that he had to bathe in the Tiber to become clean before performing his sacrifice. The Sabine, being a man of religion, believed the Roman priest and went to clean himself in the flowing streams of the Tiber river. While he was gone, the priest took the heifer and sacrificed it himself to Diana, so the goddess through the prophecy would grant the Roman people imperium. When news spread of the priest's action, everyone in the city celebrated and hailed the priest, the king included. The temple of Diana would not be the last one Servius constructed. He would also build not one, but 2 temples to the goddess Fortuna, as the king felt that fortune had always favored him his entire life. One of the temples would be put in the cattle market of the city, and the other one on the banks of the Tiber. Thanks to his magnificent rule, victories in war and embellishment of the city, Servius Tullius had now grown so popular that no one questioned his right to the throne, except for one man, Lucius Tarquinius, one of the previous king's son. Lucius felt that now having grown up, the crown of the city was his by birthright, but instead he had been pushed aside, only brought out into the light when Servius needed to boost his own legitimacy. What began as jealousy quickly morphed into hate. Lucius had even preached to the Roman populace that Servius had no right to the throne before his election to kinship had taken place. After Servius Tullius had won his election to the throne, Lucius Tarquinius stayed undismayed at his guardian's success. He would find another way to claim the title of king. The Land Distribution Act that Servius had carried out had in actuality been disapproved by the Senate, but Servius had used his power to overrule them. This act had angered many of the city's patricians, especially since he did this before he had officially become king. Lucius would now, after his first failure, focus on this disapproval and the anger it caused to gain influence against the king in the Senate, while at the same time throughout Servius' reign always be scheming in other ways to seize the throne for himself. As described earlier, Servius had wed his daughters, who both had the name Tullia, to the sons of Tarquin. The two sisters were as opposite each other as they could be. The younger one was ambitious and had married Aruns, while the older one was docile and had wed Lucius. The younger Tullia quickly began to despise her man Aruns for his own lack of ambition and glorified Lucius, whom her sister had married. She also began to hate her own sister for her lack of support in Lucius's own grand plans. She yearned for Lucius, which she viewed as the ideal Roman man, a true prince and hero. It did not take long for a terrible plan to be hatched among the ambitious Tullia and Lucius. They began meeting in secret, conversing about their unlucky situation. Both stuck with partners they hated, yearning for each other, a much better match according to themselves. The people they were stuck with were holding them back to achieving their true destiny. There was only one thing to do: murder their marital partners and instead wed each other. The deaths of Aruns and the older Tullia soon followed, and quickly after the marriage between Lucius and the younger Tullia commenced. The king Servius did not prevent their marriage, but it is said he hardly approved of it either. It did not take long for the wicked daughter of Servius to start conspiring further against her own father. She began to pester her new husband Lucius to reach for his destiny and take the crown for himself. Day and night she pushed him further and further down the slope of both patricide and regicide. She said that what she had wanted was not a person whose wife she might be called, or one with whom she might in silence live as a slave. What she had wanted was one who would consider himself worthy of the throne, who would remember that he was the son of Tarquinius Priscus, who would rather possess a kingdom than hope for it. If you, to whom I consider myself married, are such a one, I address you both as husband and king. But if not, our conditions have been changed so far for the worse, as in that person crime is associated with meanness. Why not prepare yourself? It is not necessary for you, as for your father, coming here for Corinth or Tarquini to strive for foreign thrones. Your household encounters gods, the image of your father, and the royal palace, and the royal throne in that palace, constitute and call you king. Or if you have too little spirit for this, why do you disappoint the nation? Why do you suffer yourself to be looked upon as a prince? Go hence to Tarquini or Corinth. Sink back again to your original race, more like your brother than your father. Tullia also looked at Tanaquil, the last king's wife, with envy. Tanaquil had helped orchestrate both the rise of Tarquinius Priscus and Servius Tullius. She had become and stayed an extremely influential woman, probably the most powerful woman in all of Rome. Tullia coveted what Tanaquil had, and nothing would stop her from having it. Lucius Tarquin listened to his new wife, and followed what he himself believed to be his destiny, increasing the time he spent with Rome's patrician and other powerful families, especially the so-called lesser families that King Tarquin had added to the Senate. These families' unwavering loyalty to Tarquinius Priscus was now mirrored onto his son. At the same time, Lucius vilified Servius wherever he went, preaching that this son of a slave was wholly unworthy of the crown. It should have belonged to himself instead. After some time of Tarquin's scheming, Servius started to notice what was going on. He took Tarquin to the Senate, and once there he accused Tarquin and the patricians that were on his side of treachery. What followed was a battle of words between Servius and Tarquin, in which they tried to argue against each other who the rightful king was. Most of Tarquin's arguments were based on his blood connection to the previous king, but Servius could easily counter that by arguing that Rome was an elective monarchy and not a hereditary one. He also said that if Rome was a hereditary monarchy, then Tarquin would not be a more legitimate king, because then the sons of Ancus Marcius would have inherited the throne after his death. Most people understood that in this debate Servius was in the right, but even so the king would offer to assemble the people and hold a new vote on who should hold the sovereignty of the city. In the following assembly of the Roman people, the two rivals to the throne once again argued for their cause, but Servius was a beloved king with major support from the lower classes because of everything he had done for them. When Servius was finished speaking and was about to leave the assembly, the crowd started raging against Tarquin, calling out for his death. Tarquin had to flee the assembly, while Servius was acclaimed once again by the crowds as the rightful king. After this debacle, Tarquin would with his wife Tullius' advice change strategy. Instead of openly going against the king, he would now fake remorse and work towards a reconciliation with Servius. Tarquin, being wed to Servius' daughter and being the son of the previous king, quickly rebuilt the friendship with Servius Tullius. Servius had no want of openly quarreling with the man who he had in his youth been the guardian of, and at the same time he did not want to ruin his relationship with his daughter after already having lost one. After having established good relations with the king, Tarquin once again began scheming for his overthrow with his friends, his wife, and the patricians of the city who still supported him. The next time he would make his move, he would not take any chances. He would become king, and it did not matter what he had to do to achieve his goal. When Tarquin felt that he had garnered enough support, he went to the city's forum with armed guards. In front of the Senate house, the king's throne was placed, and Lucius now sat down in it and ordered a crier to summon the Senate. When all patricians and important men had gathered, Lucius Tarquin held a speech where he blackened the name of Servius. Servius was a slave that had usurped the throne after Lucius's own father had been murdered on it. The interregnum and customary vote had been ignored during Servius' scheming, and instead a woman had placed the scepter in Servius' hand. He had taken lands from the rich and given it to the poor, and moreover he had created the census to out the patrician family's wealth to increase the poor people's envy and hate towards them. It did not take long for Servius to find out what was occurring, so he made his way to the forum, and standing in front of the senators he loudly interrupted Tarquin and demanded to know what was the meaning of this whole ordeal and why this boy was sitting in his throne. Lucius Tarquin answered, "The chair is my father's. A king's son is a better heir to the throne than a slave. We have let you mock and insult your masters long enough." What followed was total chaos. A brawl between the two sides commenced, where some senators sided with Servius while others supported Tarquin. Lucius Tarquin was in his prime and therefore stronger than his opponent. He seized Servius and threw him down the steps of the Senate house. Lucius then turned to quell the senators. Servius rose and began making his way unattended from the scene. The king was limping his way to the palace when some of Tullius' henchmen spotted him and killed him on the spot. The king had been assassinated by his own daughter. But the story grows grimmer still, as Tullia in a carriage made her way to the forum and hailed Tarquin king. She was told by her husband to head home, as the streets were still dangerous for a woman in her standing. As she was returning to her abode, she spotted her father's corpse on the road. This road was later known to the Romans as the Street of Crime, and the name was given because of what Tullia next did. In an act of bestial inhumanity, her frenzy and hatred that she was consumed by led her to drive over her own father's dead corpse with her carriage. Blood from Servius's body stained her clothes, and when she arrived at her home, parts of her parents' blood still clung to the wheels of her carriage. The reign of Servius Tullius lasted 44 years. He had been a brilliant political mastermind, creating a new constitution for Rome that would survive in parts far into the future. The census and the Comitia Centuriata would help Rome, especially with mobilizing its citizenry, and give it an edge over other states in Latium and the broader Italian peninsula. Livy, the historian, also says that Servius Tullius had plans to abdicate the monarchy in favor of a republican system, because in principle he disagreed with monarchy and its governance. Whatever one believes, Servius was one of Rome's most successful kings, and the people loved him. He was so loved, in fact, that he would come to be known as a new founder of Rome. The love everyone had for him probably grew further still when compared to the next king, Lucius Tarquin, or as we know him, Tarquin the Proud. Tarquin the Proud would rule in such an abhorrent way, which we have gotten a taste of in how he seized power, that the Romans would come to hate even the notion of monarchy and the title of king for over a millennia to come.